They say that grief is a fog that descends upon you and blinds you to the world. But for me, it was the exact opposite. Because on the day I buried my husband Arthur, the world became painfully sharp and bright. I could see every raindrop sliding down the black umbrellas, and I could smell the overpowering scent of lilies that were trying to mask the smell of wet earth, and I could see the mud on the shoes of the gravediggers standing respectfully at a distance. My name is Beatrice Galloway, and for 40 years I worked as a forensic document examiner for the state, which meant my entire career was built on noticing the tiny details that other people missed. I looked for the hesitation in a signature or the microscopic difference in ink meant to deceive a judge, and while I had retired 5 years ago to help Arthur run our vineyard, my eyes had never lost their training. The priest was reciting the final prayers, and his voice was a low drone that barely rose above the sound of the rain hitting the canopy, and everyone I loved was there, standing in a tight circle of black coats and bowed heads. It was a peaceful moment and a fitting tribute to a man who had been quiet and strong like the old vines he tended to every morning. But then the silence was shattered by the roar of an engine. I did not need to turn my head to know who it was, because the aggressive growl of a sports car engine was entirely out of place in a cemetery. The car door slammed shut with a heavy thud, and footsteps crunched hurriedly over the gravel path, approaching our solemn circle with a speed that felt disrespectful. It was Hugo Thorne. My nephew Hugo was the son of my late sister, and he was a man who always seemed to be running a race that no one else was aware of. He pushed his way through the crowd of mourners muttering apologies that sounded more like breathless excuses, and he came to stand right beside me. He smelled of peppermint breath mints, and beneath that, the sour chemical tang of adrenaline and perhaps a hint of stale whiskey from the night before. I looked up at him through my black veil, and I saw that he was wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. But it did not fit him quite right across the shoulders, as if he had bought it yesterday. He grabbed my hand and squeezed it too hard, and his palms were damp and cold. "Aunt B," he whispered loudly enough for half the funeral party to hear. "I am so crushed, and I cannot believe Uncle Arthur is gone." I watched his face carefully. I looked at the corners of his eyes, and I looked at his mouth. There was no redness and no swelling, and no genuine tension in the brow, because Hugo was not sad. Hugo was terrified. I could feel a tremor in his hand, that he was trying desperately to suppress a rhythmic shaking that I had seen 1,000 times in courtrooms when a guilty man realizes the evidence is turning against him. The service ended, and we moved back to the main house on the vineyard for the wake. The house was a sprawling Victorian estate that Arthur and I had restored with our own hands, and it was usually filled with light and the smell of cooking, but today it felt cold and hollow. Neighbors brought casseroles and muttered their condolences, and I sat in Arthur's favorite leather armchair near the fireplace, simply watching the room. I wanted to be alone, and I wanted to pour a glass of Arthur's favorite vintage and weep until my chest ached, but I could not relax because Hugo was circling the room like a shark in a tank. He was not mingling with the guests or sharing stories about his uncle. He was pacing near the hallway that led to Arthur's study. His eyes kept darting toward the heavy oak door that was currently locked. After an hour, the crowd began to thin out, and Hugo finally made his move. He pulled a chair up close to mine, and his knee almost brushed against my skirt, and he leaned in with a look of faux concern plastered across his handsome face. "Aunt B," he said softly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to talk about the estate, because I know this is a hard time, but Arthur would have wanted us to be practical." I looked at him, and I took a slow sip of water. I asked him what he meant by practical on the day of the funeral. He cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie, and I noticed the tremor in his hands was back. He said that running a vineyard is hard work, and it costs a fortune, and you are getting older. Bea and Arthur was worried about you before he passed." I stayed silent and let him talk because people who are lying hate silence, and they will always rush to fill it with more words. Hugo continued faster now, saying that Arthur spoke to him just 3 days ago at the hospital, and they made some arrangements to ensure the property was handled correctly, and to make sure I did not have to worry about the heavy lifting or the finances anymore. My heart went cold in my chest because Arthur had been in a coma for the last 3 days of his life. He had not spoken to anyone. Hugo reached into his jacket pocket and patted it as if checking that something was still there, and he smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said, "I have some paperwork that Arthur signed, and we can go over it tomorrow once you have rested. But I just wanted you to know that everything is under control, and I am going to take care of everything." He stood up then and patted my shoulder in a way that felt patronizing, and he walked out of the room, leaving me sitting by the fire. I looked at the fire, and I watched the flames dancing on the logs. I knew my husband better than anyone on earth, and I knew he would never have signed our life's work over to a man who treated wine like a gambling chip. Hugo thought he was talking to a frail old widow who was confused by grief, but he had forgotten who I used to be. He had forgotten that I spent my life hunting for liars. The week following the funeral was a blur of silence and shadows, and the house felt too large without Arthur to fill it. I spent my mornings walking the rows of vines just as the sun was cresting over the hills, and the air was crisp and smelled of damp soil and ripening grapes. The vineyard was quiet, but it was a living, breathing thing that needed care and attention. And for the first time in 40 years, I wondered if I had the strength to manage it alone. I was sitting in the sunroom drinking tea and watching the dust motes dance in the light when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway for the second time that week. It was not a polite arrival because the cars did not slow down until the very last second, and I saw Hugo's red sports car followed closely by a sleek black sedan that looked like a hearse designed for businessmen. I did not get up immediately because I wanted them to wait. I took a slow sip of my tea and smoothed the wrinkles in my cardigan, and I composed my face into a mask of tired confusion. If Hugo wanted to play games, I would let him believe he was the only player on the board. When the doorbell finally rang, it was impatient and insistent. I opened the door to find Hugo standing there, wearing a suit that was too bright a shade of blue, and beside him stood a man who looked as sharp and thin as a letter opener. Hugo did not wait to be invited in. He simply stepped past me into the foyer, bringing a gust of wind and cologne with him. "Aunt B," he said loudly, as if I were hard of hearing, "I want you to meet my legal counsel, Mr. Kress, because we have some very important business to discuss today, and we did not want to delay it any longer." Mr. Kress offered me a hand that felt like dry parchment, and he smiled a tight, thin smile that did not show any teeth. He looked around the foyer with a critical eye, as if he were appraising the value of the antique grandfather clock and the Persian rug, rather than appreciating their beauty. We moved into the study, and Hugo sat behind Arthur's mahogany desk without asking. It was a violation that made my blood boil, because that chair still held the shape of my husband's body, but I said nothing, and I sat in the small guest chair opposite them, folding my hands in my lap. Hugo opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a single document that was stapled at the top in blue cardstock. He placed it in the center of the desk and smoothed it down with his palm. "This is the transfer of ownership deed, Bea," he said, using a tone one might use with a slow child. "As I told you, Arthur was very concerned about your ability to handle the estate, and he signed this over to me 3 days before he passed to ensure that the business would continue without burdening you." I looked at the document upside down, and I could see the header in bold black letters, and at the bottom of the page, I could see a signature that looked remarkably like Arthur's. Mr. Kress cleared his throat and spoke for the first time, and his voice was dry and scratchy. He said, "Mrs. Galloway, the transfer is quite standard and irrevocable, so we simply need to formalize the transition, and we can begin the process of restructuring the assets." I looked at Hugo, and I asked him what he meant by restructuring. Hugo leaned back in Arthur's chair and clasped his hands behind his head. He said, "Well, B, the main house is far too big for one person, and the upkeep is a nightmare, and frankly the stairs are a hazard for a woman of your age, so we think it would be best if you moved into the guest cottage down by the creek." The air left my lungs. The guest cottage was a converted shed that we used for seasonal pickers during the harvest. It had no heating, and the roof leaked when it rained. He was not just taking my business, he was evicting me from the home I had built brick by brick. He continued talking without looking at me, saying that he had already spoken to a few developers about the main house and that the land value was skyrocketing, and we could turn the main estate into a luxury tasting room or a boutique hotel, which is what Arthur would have wanted. I looked down at my hands to hide the flash of rage in my eyes. Arthur would have burned this place to the ground before turning it into a tourist trap for hipsters and tech millionaires. I asked softly if I could see the document. Mr. Kress hesitated, but Hugo slid the paper across the desk with a smirk. He said, "Take your time, Aunt B, but honestly, the legal jargon is very dense, and I would hate for you to get a headache trying to parse through it all." Picked up the paper, and I felt the weight of it. It was high-quality bond paper, the kind that lawyers used for official filings. My eyes scanned the text, but I was not reading the words. I was looking at the structure of the document and the spacing of the paragraphs and the way the ink sat on the surface of the page. I saw the date next to the signature. It was indeed dated 3 days before Arthur died. I looked up at Hugo, and I made my eyes wide and watery. I said, "Hugo, this is all so sudden, and I am feeling very overwhelmed, so could I please hold on to this just for tonight so I can read it in peace and pray on it?" Hugo exchanged a glance with Mr. Kress. The lawyer gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They believed they had won. They saw an old woman clinging to the last scraps of her dignity, and they decided to be gracious in their victory. Hugo stood up and buttoned his jacket. He said, "Of course, Aunt B, you take tonight to look it over, and I will come back tomorrow morning to collect it and to help you start packing your things for the move to the cottage." They walked out of the study, and I heard the front door close and the sound of their engines fading into the distance. I sat there in the silence of the study holding the paper that claimed to steal my life away. I switched on the heavy brass desk lamp, and I pulled my reading glasses from my pocket. I was not going to pray on it. I opened the top drawer of the desk, where Arthur kept his magnifying glass, and I laid the document flat under the harsh yellow light. The grieving widow was gone. The examiner was back at work. The house was completely silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, which sounded like a slow heartbeat counting down the minutes of my life. I sat at the heavy oak desk, and I pushed aside the grief that had been my constant companion for the last week, because there was no room for tears in a crime scene investigation. I turned the brass knob of the desk lamp until the bulb was searingly bright, and I angled it low across the surface of the document. In my line of work, we called this grazing light, and it was the best way to see the topography of a page because handwriting is not just ink on paper. It is a physical act that leaves a three-dimensional landscape of valleys and ridges. I picked up Arthur's large magnifying glass, and I held it to my eye, and the world narrowed down to a single circle of illuminated truth. I focused on the signature at the bottom of the page. It read, Arthur Galloway, and at a glance, it was perfect. The capital A had the same sweeping flourish that Arthur had used since he was a young man, and the double L in our last name had the familiar loop that always looked a bit like a ribbon. To a banker or a lawyer or a grieving widow, this was Arthur's hand, but I was none of those things. I looked closer. When a person writes their own name, it is a subconscious reflex, and the pen moves rapidly and smoothly like a bird in flight. But when a forger tries to copy a signature, they are drawing a picture rather than writing a word, and that hesitation leaves microscopic evidence. I looked at the connecting stroke between the O and the W in Galloway. Under the magnification, I saw it, a tiny blob of ink, a hesitation point. The person writing this had stopped for a fraction of a second to look at a model signature and then continued, and the ink had pooled just slightly where the pen rested too long. Then I turned the paper over and ran my fingertips lightly across the back of the page. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of the thrill of the hunt. The paper was bumpy. The signature had been pressed into the page with significant force so deep that I could feel the ridges of the letters on the reverse side. Arthur had been in a coma for 3 days before he died. In the weeks prior, he had been so weak that I had to help him hold a spoon to eat his soup. His muscles had atrophied, and his grip was as fragile as a dried leaf. There was absolutely no physical way my husband could have generated enough pressure to indent heavy bond paper like this. This was the work of a healthy man. A man with strong hands and a lot of adrenaline. A man who was perhaps angry or desperate or frightened while he wrote. I sat back in the chair and took off my glasses. Hugo had forged the deed. He had done a decent job of copying the shape, but he had completely failed to mimic the pressure and the rhythm. It was a clumsy attempt fueled by greed and arrogance. I knew the truth now, but knowledge is not the same thing as proof in a court of law. If I went to the police tomorrow with just my opinion, they would see a bitter old woman fighting a losing battle against a grieving nephew with a signed legal document. I needed more. I needed to find the model he used to copy the signature, and I needed to find the pen he used because ink chemical analysis is like a fingerprint. I heard a car door slam outside, and I realized with a start that the sun was already coming up. I had spent the entire night staring at one piece of paper. I quickly folded the document and placed it on the corner of the desk, and I rubbed my face to make sure I looked exhausted and worn down. I needed Hugo to believe that his plan was working perfectly. The front door opened without a knock, and Hugo breezed in, carrying 2 coffees and a brown paper bag. He looked fresh and energetic, and the smell of expensive cologne preceded him into the room. "Good morning, Aunt B," he called out cheerfully as he walked into the study. "I hope you managed to get some sleep, and I hope you have come to terms with the transition, because the movers are on standby." I stood up slowly, and I let my shoulders slump. I made my hands tremble just a little as I reached for the coffee he offered. I said, "Hugo, I have been up all night reading this over and over, and I am just so confused because I do not remember Arthur ever mentioning this to me, and my mind feels like a fog these days." Hugo smiled, and it was a predatory smile. He walked around the desk and picked up the document, tucking it safely into his jacket pocket. He said, "I know it is confusing, B, and that is exactly why Arthur did it this way, because he knew you were getting forgetful, and he wanted to protect you from the stress of business. So really, this is an act of love." I forced myself to nod. I looked at him with watery eyes and said, "Well, if you say so, Hugo, then I suppose I must trust you, because you are family, and family looks out for each other." He patted my arm and said exactly. "And now why don't you go upstairs and start packing your personal items, because I have a team coming to clear out the heavy furniture by noon." I turned and walked out of the study, and I heard him chuckle softly to himself as he pulled out his phone to make a call. He thought I was defeated. He thought I was a senile old woman who was ready to be put out to pasture. As I climbed the stairs, I gripped the banister hard to stop my hands from shaking with rage. I was going to pack all right, but I wasn't packing to leave. I was packing for war. I stood in the center of the master bedroom holding a silver picture frame that felt cold against my palm, and I looked at the open cardboard box on the bed, which was supposed to contain 40 years of my life. Hugo had given me until noon to vacate the main house and move into the guest cottage, but I was moving with the speed of a glacier because I knew that impatience makes people reckless, and I needed Hugo to be reckless. I carefully wrapped a porcelain figurine in tissue paper and placed it into the box with agonizing slowness while I listened to the sounds of the house. Downstairs, I could hear heavy boots thumping against the hardwood floors as the movers Hugo had hired began hauling away the furniture I had chosen with Arthur decades ago. It sounded like they were looting a tomb, and every scrape of wood against wood felt like a physical blow to my ribs. Then suddenly, the house died. The low hum of the refrigerator that I had listened to for years cut out, and the overhead fan that was spinning lazily above my head wobbled to a stop, and the digital clock on the bedside table went blank. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy, and the air in the room instantly felt still and stagnant. I did not move. I did not gasp. I simply set the figurine down and waited because I knew exactly what this was. A moment later, I heard Hugo's footsteps pounding up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He burst into the bedroom, looking flushed and panicked, but his eyes were too bright and too alert for a man delivering bad news. "Aunt B," he shouted breathlessly. "Are you all right? Because the whole system just went down, and I was so worried about you being up here in the dark." I looked at him, and then I looked at the window, where the midday sun was streaming in, brightly illuminating the dust motes in the air. I told him calmly that I was perfectly fine, and that it was hardly dark, seeing as it was noon on a Tuesday. He ran a hand through his hair and shook his head, looking gravely serious. He said, "Well, the electrician just took a look at the main breaker panel in the basement, and he says the wiring in this old place is completely shot, and it is a massive fire hazard." I watched him lie, and I marveled at how easy it was for him. The wiring in this house had been completely redone 5 years ago when we renovated the kitchen, and Arthur had insisted on the highest industrial standards because of the winery equipment. Hugo continued pressing his advantage, saying that we cannot turn the power back on until the whole house is rewired, which could take weeks or even months, so you really cannot stay here tonight, B, because it is simply not safe for a woman of your age to be in a house without heat or lights or running water. He was trying to flush me out. He wanted me in the cottage where I would be isolated and uncomfortable and out of his way, so he could tear through the house looking for anything else of value. I walked over to the antique vanity and picked up a box of long tapered candles and a book of matches. I turned to him and smiled the vacant smile of a stubborn old woman. I said, "Hugo, you are so sweet to worry about me, but Arthur and I lived in this house during the great storm of '98 when the power was out for 10 days, and we found it quite romantic." Hugo's jaw tightened, and the vein in his neck pulsed. He stepped closer into my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He said, "Aunt B, this is not a game, and I am responsible for your safety now, and if you refuse to leave a dangerous building, I might have to call social services or the authorities to have you moved to a facility where you can be properly looked after." There it was, the threat. He was telling me that if I did not go quietly to the shed, he would have me committed to a nursing home. I looked him dead in the eye, and for a second, I almost dropped the mask. I almost told him that I had stared down murderers and cartel bosses in federal courtrooms, and that a nephew in a cheap suit did not frighten me, but I held back. I let my shoulders sag, and I looked down at the floor. I said, "Very well, Hugo, if it is that dangerous, then I suppose I should not be in the way, but I am feeling very frail today, and I think I just need to sit here in my chair for a while and rest before I can walk down the hill to the cottage." He let out a sigh of exasperation that sounded like a hiss. He said, "Fine, take an hour to rest, but I want you out before sunset, because I am locking the doors for your own protection." He turned and stormed out of the room, and I listened to his footsteps retreating down the hall. I waited until I heard the front door slam, and then I moved. I did not pack clothes. I went to the small safe in the back of the closet and spun the dial. I took out a heavy metal lockbox that contained my forensic kit. I took out my UV light and my magnifying loops and my chemical reagents. If he was going to cut the lights, that was fine by me. Darkness was good. Darkness was where I did my best work. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the sun begin to dip toward the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. The house was getting cold now, and the shadows were stretching long across the floorboards. I lit a single candle and placed it on the nightstand. Let him think I was freezing. Let him think I was scared. Tonight, while he slept, I was going to find the proof that would bury him. Midnight in a house without power is a different kind of darkness because it feels heavy and suffocating, like being wrapped in thick black velvet. I waited until the luminous hands of my watch showed 3 a.m. before I swung my legs out of bed. The house was freezing now that the heating had been off for 12 hours, and I could see my breath pluming in the silver moonlight that filtered through the sheer curtains. I did not turn on a flashlight because I did not need one. I had lived in this house for 40 years, and my feet knew every creak in the floorboards and every turn of the hallway by heart. I moved like a shadow down the main staircase, stepping on the edges of the steps where the wood was supported by the beams so I would not make a sound. Hugo was sleeping in the guest suite on the ground floor, and as I passed his door, I could hear the faint rhythm of his snoring. He was sleeping the sleep of the arrogant and the victorious, believing that he had already won the war, and that his only obstacle was a confused old woman who was probably shivering under her quilts upstairs. But I was not heading for the kitchen or the living room. I was heading for the cellar door that was tucked away behind the pantry. The wine vault was Arthur's sanctuary, and it was the heart of the Galloway estate. It was built deep into the limestone bedrock beneath the house to maintain a constant temperature and humidity, and it held bottles that were older than I was. I eased the heavy oak door open, and the smell hit me instantly. It was the smell of damp earth and old cork, and the sweet, musty scent of aging grapes. It was the smell of my life with Arthur. I crept down the stone stairs, counting them as I went, and when I reached the bottom, I saw a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. The main vault door, which should have been locked and bolted, was standing slightly ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to breathe slowly and evenly. I moved closer to the gap in the door and peered inside with one eye. The vault was illuminated by a battery-powered construction lamp that cast harsh, jagged shadows against the racks of bottles. And there was Hugo. He was not asleep in the guest suite, as I had thought. He was here in the Holy of Holies, wearing his expensive suit trousers and a rumpled white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was pacing back and forth in front of the back wall, which was the section we called the library. This was where we kept the 1945 Victory vintage. It was the year the war ended and the year Arthur's father had planted the first vines on this land. And those bottles were not just wine, they were history in liquid form. They were worth thousands of dollars each, but to Arthur they had been priceless. Hugo was holding one of the dusty bottles in his hand, and he was treating it with the casual disregard one might show a bottle of ketchup. He was on his cell phone, and his voice was tight and high-pitched, echoing off the stone walls. He said, Listen to me. I am telling you the assets are secured, and I have the deed in my hand, and the old lady is not going to be a problem because she is halfway to the nursing home already." I pressed myself against the cold stone wall and listened. There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line spoke, and then Hugo snapped back aggressively. He said, "I know how much I owe you, and I know the deadline is Friday. But this inventory alone is worth $2 million on the gray market, so you just need to back off and give me 3 days to liquidate it." I felt a cold knot of rage tighten in my stomach. He was not just stealing the land. He was going to strip the legacy of this vineyard and sell it off to pay for his gambling debts. He was going to take 40 years of Arthur's passion and hard work and pour it down the drain to save his own skin. Hugo stopped pacing and held the bottle up to the light, wiping the dust off the label with his thumb. He said, "I have a buyer coming to the dinner party on Thursday, and he is a collector from Hong Kong who pays cash, so once he tastes this vintage and sees the deed, he will wire the funds, and I will transfer your cut immediately." Thursday, the dinner party. That was the timeline. I had 48 hours before he sold the soul of this family to a stranger. I watched as he shoved the priceless bottle into a cardboard box on the floor, with no padding and no care. The glass clinked dangerously against another bottle, and I flinched physically at the sound. He was desperate, and desperate men are sloppy. He was so focused on the money that he wasn't thinking about the details. He had forged the deed, and now he was rushing the sale, and he was bringing his buyers right into the house to flaunt his victory. I had seen enough. I knew the motive now, and I knew the plan. Hugo owed money to dangerous people, and he needed to sell the Galloway vines to pay them back before they broke his legs. That was why the forgery was so rushed. That was why the signature had the tremor. I backed away slowly up the stone stairs, moving 1 inch at a time until I was back in the safety of the pantry. I closed the cellar door silently and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. He thought the dinner party on Thursday was going to be his coronation. He thought he was going to dazzle a foreign buyer with stolen wine and a fake deed. I made my way back up to my cold bedroom and crawled under the covers, but I did not sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling and planning. Hugo wanted a show on Thursday night. He wanted a grand unveiling. Well, I decided as I watched the first gray light of dawn creep into the room, I would give him a show he would never forget. But first, I needed the gun. Not a firearm, of course, but the forensic equivalent. I needed the pen he used to sign Arthur's name. The next morning, the sun rose hot and bright over the valley, burning off the morning mist and revealing the rows of vines that stretched out like soldiers in formation. I sat by the window in the kitchen, wrapped in a shawl and sipping hot water, because with the power still cut off, I could not even make a pot of coffee. I watched through the sheer curtains as Hugo walked out to his sports car. He was wearing sunglasses and talking rapidly into his phone, and he looked every inch the busy executive closing a major deal. He threw a leather satchel into the passenger seat and sped off down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the stagnant air. I waited until the sound of his engine had completely faded into the distance before I dropped the shawl and stood up. The frail old woman vanished instantly, and in her place stood the investigator. I walked out the back door and headed straight for the old barn. Hugo had told me he set up a temporary office in the tack room because the internet signal was stronger there, but I knew he just wanted a place where he could hide his secrets away from my prying eyes. The barn smelled of dry hay and old leather, and the sweet scent of the horses we used to keep years ago. The door to the tack room was closed but not locked because Hugo was arrogant, and he believed that I was too respectful of privacy to snoop. I stepped inside, and the contrast was jarring. The room still had the rustic wooden walls and the hooks for saddles, but Hugo had brought in a sleek modern glass desk and a high-tech ergonomic chair that looked like it belonged on a spaceship rather than in a barn. I put on a pair of latex gloves from my pocket because Locard's exchange principle states that every contact leaves a trace, and I did not intend to leave any of mine. I began to search. I started with the desk drawers. They were filled with overdue notices for credit cards and threatening letters from casinos in Las Vegas and Atlantic City. The numbers were staggering, and seeing them in black and white confirmed everything I had heard in the wine cellar. Hugo wasn't just in debt, he was drowning, and he was grabbing at my husband's legacy like a lifeline. But I wasn't looking for financial records. I was looking for the murder weapon. In document forgery, the pen is the weapon. Every ink has a specific chemical composition, and every pen nib leaves a unique scratch pattern on the paper fibers. If I could find the pen he used to sign the deed, I could scientifically prove that the signature was created by Hugo and not by Arthur. I looked in the pen cup on the desk. It was filled with cheap ballpoints and promotional markers from hotels. None of them were right. The signature on the deed had the fluid line variation of a fountain pen. I checked his briefcase, which he had foolishly left behind in his rush. I opened the leather flap and rummaged through the files. Nothing. I stood in the center of the room and closed my eyes, trying to think like him. Hugo was a man who cared about appearances. He was a man who wore Italian suits and drove a German car. If he was going to forge a legal deed worth millions, he would not use a cheap Bic pen. He would use something that made him feel powerful. I looked at the top shelf of the bookcase where he had shoved some old horse trophies aside to make room for a humidor. Next to the humidor was a small velvet box. I reached up and took it down. I opened the lid, and there it was. It was a heavy black fountain pen with gold trim. A Mont Blanc. It was ostentatious and expensive, and exactly the kind of thing Hugo would buy to pretend he was a tycoon. I unscrewed the cap, and the nib glided out, looking sharp and clean. I pulled a small notepad from my pocket and made a single stroke on the paper. The ink flowed wet and dark. It was a blue-black shade with a distinct sheen. I pulled out my jeweler's loupe and examined the line. The ink pooled slightly at the end of the stroke, just like the hesitation mark I had seen on the forged deed. This was it. But then my eyes fell on the wastepaper basket in the corner of the room. It was overflowing with crumpled balls of paper. I walked over and picked one up, smoothing it out on the glass desk. It was a sheet of hotel stationery covered in handwriting. But it wasn't a letter. It was a name written over and over again. Arthur Galloway. Arthur Galloway. Arthur Galloway. Some of them were crossed out with angry slashes. Some of them were shaky, and at the bottom of the page was one that looked nearly perfect. My breath caught in my throat. This was the practice sheet. This was the smoking gun. This piece of paper proved that Hugo had spent hours training his hand to mimic my husband's signature. I carefully folded the practice sheet and placed it in a plastic evidence bag I had brought with me. I took the pen and placed it in another bag. I was just sealing the Ziploc when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. My heart stopped. He was back early. I scrambled to put the velvet box back on the shelf, but my hand slipped, and it knocked against the humidor with a loud wooden clack. I froze, waiting to see if he had heard. The car door slammed outside. Footsteps crunched on the gravel heading straight for the barn. I looked around frantically. There was no back exit to the tack room. I was trapped in a glass box with the evidence of his crime in my pocket and the man who would ruin me walking toward the door. I shoved the evidence bags deep into the pocket of my cardigan, and I grabbed a dust rag from the shelf. When the door handle turned and Hugo stepped into the room, I was standing there, polishing his glass desk with the vacant smile of a helpful aunt. Hugo stopped in the doorway, and his eyes went wide with suspicion. He looked at me, and then he looked at the shelf where the velvet box was slightly askew. "What are you doing in here, Bea?" he asked, and his voice was low and dangerous. The silence in the tack room was so absolute that I could hear the buzzing of a single fly trapped against the window pane, and I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. Hugo stood in the doorway, blocking the only exit, and his silhouette was framed by the bright sunlight outside, making it impossible to see his eyes behind his dark sunglasses. I gripped the dirty dust rag tighter in my hand, and I forced my heart to slow down, because if I showed even a flicker of fear or guilt, he would know that I was not just a helpful old aunt. I was a threat. I lifted the rag and wiped a smudge off the corner of his glass desk, and I looked up at him with a smile that felt pasted on my face. "Oh, Hugo, you startled me," I said, letting my voice quaver just a little. "I was just coming down to see the horses, but then I remembered we sold them years ago, and I saw how dusty this room was, and I suppose I just started cleaning out of habit." Hugo did not smile. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and the click of the latch sounded like a gunshot. He took off his sunglasses slowly, and his eyes were cold and hard, like polished stones. He walked around the desk and stood right next to me so close that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He looked at the desk, and then he looked at the shelf where the velvet box sat slightly askew. My heart hammered against the evidence bag in my pocket, and I prayed that the plastic would not crinkle. He grabbed my wrist. It was not a gentle hold. His fingers dug into my skin, and I gasped in genuine pain, but he did not let go. "Aunt Bea," he said, and his voice was low and terrifyingly calm. "This has to stop, because I am getting very worried about your mental state." I tried to pull my arm back, but he held it firm. I asked him what he meant. He leaned in closer and lowered his voice to a whisper. He said, "You are wandering around confused, and you are forgetting things, and now you are in here, snooping around my private business, which tells me that the dementia is progressing faster than we thought." I stared at him, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was the gaslight. He was taking my discovery and twisting it into a symptom of madness. He was rewriting reality to suit his narrative. He continued saying that Arthur warned me about this before he died. And he told me that you were losing your grip on reality, and that you were becoming paranoid and difficult. I knew that was a lie, because Arthur respected my mind more than anything else. But Hugo said it with such conviction that for a split second, I almost felt a wave of doubt wash over me, which is exactly what he wanted. He released my wrist, and I rubbed the red marks his fingers had left behind. Hugo walked over to the window and looked out at the vineyard, keeping his back to me. He said, "I have been speaking with Mr. Kress, and given your behavior today, I think we need to consider a competency hearing. Because if you cannot respect boundaries, and if you are wandering into unsafe areas, then you clearly cannot live on your own, even in the guest cottage." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. A competency hearing. He wanted to strip me of my legal rights. He wanted to put me in a home where I would be medicated and silenced so he could sell off the vineyard without anyone asking questions about the forged deed. I looked at his back, and I felt a surge of hatred so pure it almost choked me. But I swallowed it down. I needed him to think he had won. I needed him to think I was broken. I let out a sob. It was a fake sob, but it sounded wet and pathetic in the quiet room. I said, "Oh, Hugo, please do not send me away, because I promise I will not be a bother, and I just want to stay near Arthur's memory, and I am sorry if I was confused today." Hugo turned around and looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. He saw a weeping old woman who was terrified of the future. He did not see the forensic. The house came back to life with a sudden and jarring hum as the refrigerator compressor kicked in, and the overhead lights flickered on, washing the bedroom in a harsh, artificial yellow. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the digital clock on the nightstand beep as it reset itself. It was a miracle of modern engineering how the dangerous wiring that Hugo had claimed was a fire hazard just yesterday had suddenly fixed itself the moment he needed the house to look presentable for his wealthy investors. I did not have much time before Hugo would come upstairs to check on me. So I pulled my cell phone from beneath the mattress where I had hidden it. I dialed a number that I had not called in 5 years, but one that I knew by heart. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered on the other end. Desmond Black speaking. Desmond was a retired federal judge who had presided over half the cases I had worked on during my career, and he was a man who respected evidence more than he respected the law itself. I kept my voice low and steady. I said, "Desmond, it is Beatrice Galloway, and I need you to listen to me very carefully, because I do not have much time, and I need a warrant executed tonight at 8 o'clock. There was a pause on the line, and then his tone shifted from annoyance to sharp alertness. He asked me what I had. I told him everything. I told him about the forged deed, and the tremor in the signature, and the practice sheet I had found in the trash, and the Mont Blanc pen that was currently burning a hole in my pocket. I told him about the elder abuse and the gaslighting and the theft of the 1945 Victory vintage. Desmond listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked one question. He asked if I was safe. I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror, and I saw a woman who looked tired and gray, but whose eyes were burning with a cold fire. I said, "I am safe enough, Desmond, but I need you to bring the sheriff, and I need you to wait until I give the signal, because I want to do this publicly, and I want to destroy his reputation before you put him in handcuffs." He chuckled a dry, rusty sound. He said, "Beatrice, you always did have a flair for the dramatic, but very well, I will have a car at the bottom of the drive at 7:30. I hung up the phone and slipped it back under the mattress just as heavy footsteps approached the door. Hugo knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer. He was carrying a garment bag and a shoebox, and he looked manic with energy. "Aunt B," he said, his voice booming with false cheer. "Look at this, the power is back on, which is just such a relief, and I brought you something to wear for tonight because I want you to look elegant for our guests." He laid the dress on the bed. It was a dark navy silk that looked expensive but severe. It was the kind of dress you put on a woman when you want her to fade into the background. I stood up and touched the fabric. I forced my hands to shake. I turned to him and I lowered my head in submission. I said, "Hugo, I have been thinking about what you said in the barn, and you are right, because I have been feeling so confused lately, and I do not want to be a burden to you or to the memory of this estate." Hugo's shoulders dropped an inch, and he exhaled a long breath of relief. He thought the battle was over. He thought he had broken me. He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezing it with a possessive weight. He said, "I knew you would see reason, Aunt B, and honestly, this is the best thing for everyone, because once you sign the papers tonight, we can get you into a nice facility with round-the-clock care, and you won't have to worry about a thing." I looked up at him and made my eyes wet with tears. I said, "I will sign the papers, Hugo, I promise, but I have one small request, because this house has been my life for 40 years. He looked impatient, checking his watch. He asked what it was. I said, "I want to make a toast. I want to bring out one bottle of the 1945 Victory Vintage, and I want to pour a glass for your investors, and I want to toast to Arthur and to you and to the future of the company before I sign the deed." Hugo hesitated. He was greedy, but he was also stingy, and the thought of opening a $10,000 bottle of wine clearly pained him. But then he looked at me, and he saw a defeated old woman asking for one last moment of dignity. He smiled, a thin, tight smile. He said, "Fine, Aunt B, if it means that much to you, we can open one bottle. But after the toast, you sign the papers immediately, and then you go upstairs and let the men talk business." I nodded gratefully, grasping his hand with both of mine. I said, "Thank you, Hugo. That is all I ask." He patted my hand and turned to leave, telling me to be ready in an hour. I watched the door close, and the moment he was gone, I stopped shaking. I walked over to the garment bag and unzipped it. I would wear his dress. I would play his game. I moved to my desk and opened the drawer where I kept my special equipment. I took out a small laser pointer and slipped it into my pocket next to the Mont Blanc pen. I took out a portable high-intensity UV flashlight and hid it in my sleeve. Hugo wanted a signature. He wanted a transfer of power. Tonight, I was going to give him a transfer of power, but it was not going to be the one he expected. I was going to turn his dinner party into a courtroom, and I was going to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. I sat down at the vanity and began to pin up my gray hair. I looked at the woman in the mirror, and I whispered to her, "Showtime." The dining room had been transformed into a stage set for a play about wealth and success, because Hugo had spared no expense in trying to impress the men who were coming to buy my life out from under me. The long mahogany table was set with my grandmother's silver, and the crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted duck and expensive truffle oil. I descended the stairs, slowly gripping the banister with a white-knuckled intensity that looked like frailty, but was actually suppressed rage. I was wearing the severe navy dress Hugo had chosen, and I had left my face pale and unpowdered to enhance the effect of a woman who was fading away. Hugo met me at the bottom of the stairs, and he looked like a coiled spring. His tuxedo was sharp, but I could see a sheen of sweat on his upper lip, and his eyes were darting toward the front door every few seconds. He took my arm and whispered in my ear that I looked lovely, but he squeezed my bicep hard enough to leave a bruise, reminding me without words that one wrong move would land me in a locked ward. The doorbell rang and the performance began. The buyers were led by a man named Mr. Chen, who was a property developer from Hong Kong, with a reputation for stripping assets and flipping them for massive profits. He was a small man with eyes that moved like a calculator, and he was flanked by two younger associates who carried briefcases and wore matching expressions of boredom. Hugo greeted them with a boisterous enthusiasm that felt desperate. He poured drinks and slapped backs and laughed too loudly at jokes that were not funny. He introduced me as his dear Aunt Beatrice, who was retiring to a quiet life of leisure, and Mr. Chen barely glanced at me, offering a dismissive nod, as if I were a piece of antique furniture that came with the house. We sat down to dinner, and I took my place at the foot of the table, sitting in silence, while the men talked about acreage and soil composition and yield projections. They spoke about tearing down the old fermentation shed to build a helicopter pad, and they discussed ripping up the Zinfandel vines that Arthur had planted with his own hands, because Pinot Noir was currently trending higher in the Asian markets. I ate nothing. I simply moved the food around my plate and watched them carve up my history like it was the roast duck on the platter. Hugo kept glancing at me, checking to make sure I was playing my part. Every time our eyes met, I gave him a weak, confused smile and took a sip of water. I could see him relaxing inch by inch as the meal went on and the wine flowed. He thought he had navigated the minefield. He thought the danger had passed. As the plates were cleared, Mr. Chen wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and placed both hands flat on the table. He said, "Mr. Thorne, the dinner was excellent, but we are on a tight schedule, so I would like to conclude the business portion of the evening now, because my associates have prepared the wire transfer, and we just need to verify the title chain." Hugo beamed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the forged deed. He placed it in the center of the table between the silver salt cellar and the floral centerpiece. He said, "Of course, Mr. Chen, everything is in order, and as you can see, my aunt signed the transfer of ownership to me just before my uncle passed, so the title is clean and ready for your acquisition." Mr. Chen picked up the document and scanned it, his eyes lingering on the signature at the bottom. Hugo turned to me and cleared his throat. He said, "Aunt B, perhaps you would like to confirm for Mr. Chen that this is indeed Arthur's wish and that you are happy to proceed with the sale." This was the moment. The room went silent. 4 pairs of eyes turned to look at the old woman at the end of the table. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the table, as if my legs were weak. I looked at Mr. Chen, and then I looked at Hugo. I said, "I will confirm everything in due time, gentlemen, but first, as I promised my nephew, I would like to propose a toast to honor the legacy of this vineyard before it changes hands." Hugo looked annoyed, but he did not want to cause a scene in front of the buyer, so he forced a smile and nodded. He said, "Very well, Aunt B, let's have the toast." I walked over to the sideboard where the bottle of 1945 Victory Vintage was sitting like a dark jewel. I picked it up, and I felt the weight of the glass. This bottle was worth more than Hugo's car. It was the last surviving bottle from the harvest that marked the end of the war and the beginning of the Galloway family. I carried it back to the table, and I gestured for the waiter to open it. The cork came out with a soft sigh that sounded like a ghost exhaling. The dark red liquid was poured into 5 glasses. The aroma filled the room instantly, a complex bouquet of dried cherries and leather and tobacco that silenced the table with its sheer power. I picked up my glass and held it high. My hand was not shaking anymore. I looked directly at Hugo, and for the first time that night, I dropped the mask. My eyes were clear and sharp and cold. I said, "Gentlemen, you are about to drink a wine that was created by a man of honor and patience." My husband, Arthur, believed that truth always rises to the top, just like the cream in fresh milk, and just like the sediment in a fine vintage. I took a sip, and the taste was magnificent. I placed the glass down hard on the table with a loud clack that made the men jump. I said, "But before you drink, I think it is only fair that I explain the unique provenance of the document sitting on this table, because just like this wine, a signature has a chemistry and a history that cannot be faked." Hugo's smile faltered. He started to stand up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. He said, "Aunt B, you are tired, and I think it is time for you to go upstairs." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Mont Blanc pen and the laser pointer. I said, "Sit down, Hugo, because I am not tired. I am just getting started." The atmosphere in the dining room shifted instantly from a celebratory dinner to a tense standoff, and the air felt charged with static electricity. Hugo was standing halfway out of his chair with his face flushed a deep crimson, and his hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He looked at Mr. Chen and gave a laugh that sounded more like a bark. He said, "Please forgive my aunt, gentlemen, because as I mentioned, her medication makes her say the strangest things, and really we should just sign the papers and let her go to bed." Mr. Chen did not look at Hugo. He looked at me. He was a man who had made his fortune by spotting structural weaknesses in buildings and in contracts, and he was looking at me with the calculating gaze of a predator who realizes he has walked into a trap. He waved his hand at Hugo, without breaking eye contact with me. He said, "Sit down, Mr. Thorne, because I would like to hear what the lady has to say about the provenance of this document." Hugo sank back into his chair, looking like a deflated balloon. He opened his mouth to protest, but I silenced him with a single sharp look. I turned my attention to the document in the center of the table. I took the small UV flashlight from my sleeve and clicked it on. A beam of ultraviolet light cut through the dim, romantic lighting of the room and washed over the paper, turning the white bond paper a glowing violet. I spoke clearly, and my voice was no longer the wavering voice of an old woman, but the cool, practiced tone of an expert witness delivering testimony. I said, "Gentlemen, forgery is an art, but it is an imperfect one, because the human hand cannot replicate the subconscious rhythm of another person without leaving microscopic evidence." I pointed the laser at the signature, specifically at the loop of the letter G in Galloway. I said, "Look closely at this curve. Under normal light, it looks smooth, but under magnification, you would see that the line is actually made of tiny jagged movements. We call this the tremor of deceit. It happens when the writer is drawing the letters slowly instead of writing them naturally, and it is the hallmark of a forgery." Hugo slammed his hand on the table, making the wine glasses jump. He shouted, "This is insane, because you are just shining a light on a piece of paper and making up stories to confuse these men." I ignored him completely. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Mont Blanc pen I had stolen from the barn. I placed it gently on the table next to the deed. I said, "This is a Mont Blanc Meisterstück fountain pen which was found in your tack room this morning, Hugo. The ink in this pen is a blue-black iron gall mixture, which is very distinctive." I turned to Mr. Chen. I said, "If you were to send this document to a laboratory, they would tell you that the ink on this deed is chemically identical to the ink in this pen. They would also tell you that the pressure ridges on the back of the paper indicate a heavy hand. A hand much younger and stronger than my husband's was in his final days." Mr. Chen picked up the deed and looked at it with narrowed eyes. He looked at the signature, and then he looked at the pen. The silence in the room was deafening. I continued my dismantling of Hugo's life. I said my husband Arthur was in a coma for 3 days before he died, and his hands were atrophied from illness. He could not hold a spoon, let alone generate the pressure required to create these indentations. Hugo was breathing hard now, his chest heaving. He snarled at me, saying, "You have no idea what you are talking about, because you are just a gardener, bee, and you don't know anything about legal documents or handwriting analysis." I smiled then. It was a cold smile. I said, "That is where you are wrong, Hugo. Because you were so busy waiting for me to die that you never bothered to ask how I spent the first 40 years of my life." I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table. I said I was not a gardener. I was the senior forensic document examiner for the State Department of Justice. I have testified in over 200 federal cases. I have sent men to prison for forging checks and wills and confessions that were far better executed than this clumsy attempt. The color drained from Hugo's face so completely that he looked like a wax figure. He stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. He had lived in my house and eaten my food, but he had never seen me. He had only seen an old woman, and in his arrogance, he assumed that was all I could ever be. Mr. Chen stood up abruptly. He dropped the deed onto the table as if it were contaminated with a disease. He looked at Hugo with pure ice in his eyes. He said, "Mr. Thorne, it appears you have wasted my time and attempted to defraud my firm with a falsified title." Hugo stammered, trying to find words. He said, "Wait, no, she is lying. She is just a crazy old witch who is trying to ruin me." Mr. Chen signaled to his associates. They snapped their briefcases shut with a finality that sounded like a judge's gavel. Mr. Chen said, "We are leaving immediately, and my legal team will be in contact regarding the breach of our preliminary agreement." I watched them walk toward the door. Hugo was shaking now, not with a tremor of deceit, but with the tremor of total collapse. He looked at the deed on the table, and then he looked at me, and his eyes were wild and desperate. He lunged for the paper. He screamed, "I am not losing this," and he grabbed the deed, trying to crumple it into his pocket to destroy the evidence. But I did not move to stop him. I simply picked up my glass of 1945 Victory Vintage and took a slow sip. I said, "It does not matter if you destroy that paper, Hugo, because the police are already here." The double oak doors of the dining room swung open with a heavy thud, and the sound of heavy footsteps on the hardwood floors replaced the tense silence that had gripped the room. Standing in the doorway was Judge Desmond Black, looking like an ancient stone monument in his charcoal overcoat, and beside him stood Sheriff Miller, with his thumb hooked into his belt, and his face set in a grim expression of duty. Hugo froze with the crumpled deed halfway to his pocket, and the light of the chandelier caught the sweat dripping down his forehead, and he looked like a panicked animal caught in the high beams of a truck. He tried to straighten his jacket, and he tried to summon his old charm, but his voice failed him, and only a dry croak came out of his throat. Judge Black stepped into the room, and his eyes swept over the half-eaten dinner and the expensive wine and the broken man standing at the head of the table. He looked at me and gave a small, respectful nod, and then he turned his gaze to Hugo. Desmond said, "Hugo Thorne, you are currently in possession of a forged legal instrument, and you have attempted to use that instrument to defraud a legitimate business entity. And more importantly, you have committed a gross act of elder abuse against your own flesh and blood." Hugo found his voice then, but it was high and screechy, and it lacked any of its former power. He shouted that this was a private family matter, and that his aunt was confused, and that she was making up stories because she was grieving. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, and he pulled a plastic evidence bag from his pocket. Inside the bag was the practice sheet I had rescued from the trash in the barn. The sheriff said, "We found your homework, Hugo, and we have the hotel stationery where you practiced your uncle's signature 64 times until you thought you had it right. But unfortunately for you, you were practicing in front of a woman who knows more about handwriting than you know about your own name." Hugo looked at the practice sheet, and he looked at the sheriff, and then he looked at me with a hatred that was so cold it felt like a draft in the room. He realized in that moment that he had never been in control, and he realized that the senile old woman he thought he was bullying had been documenting his every move with the precision of a surgeon. The associates of Mr. Chen watched the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination, while Mr. Chen himself stood by the window with his arms crossed, looking satisfied that he had not signed his name to Hugo's sinking ship. Sheriff Miller walked over to Hugo and told him to put the crumpled deed on the table and to keep his hands where they could be seen. Hugo hesitated for a second, as if he were considering running, but he looked at the judge and he looked at the sheriff, and he saw that there was no way out. He dropped the paper on the mahogany surface, and it uncurled slowly next to a silver spoon. As the sheriff pulled the metal handcuffs from his belt and moved behind Hugo, the reality of the situation finally seemed to hit my nephew. The arrogance drained out of him and was replaced by a pathetic trembling that made his expensive tuxedo look like a costume that did not fit. He looked at me as the metal ratcheted shut around his wrists, and he whispered, "Why did you have to do this, Bea? Because I am your family, and I was going to take care of you." I stood up, and I walked over to the head of the table, and I picked up the bottle of 1945 Victory Vintage. I looked at the liquid inside, and I thought about the decades of sun and rain and labor that went into every drop. I said, "You were never family, Hugo, because family does not steal the legacy of the dead, and family does not try to lock their elders away in the dark so they can pay off a gambling debt. You did not want to take care of me, and you wanted to erase me, but you forgot that I am the one who keeps the records." Sheriff Miller led him toward the door, and Hugo stumbled over the rug as he was taken out of the house he had tried to steal. I heard the sound of the police car doors closing outside, and I heard the gravel crunching under the tires as the sirens began to fade into the night. The dining room was quiet once more, but the air felt lighter, and the smell of the lilies seemed to vanish, being replaced by the clean scent of the night air coming through the open door. Judge Black walked over to me and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, and he asked me if I was going to be all right. I looked at the empty chair where Arthur used to sit, and I felt a single tear finally roll down my cheek. But it was not a tear of grief, and it was a tear of relief. I said, "I am going to be just fine, Desmond, because the vineyard is safe, and the truth is on the record, and tomorrow morning I have a harvest to oversee." I watched him leave, and then I sat back down in my chair, and I picked up my glass of wine. The house was mine again. The silence was mine again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. The sun was beginning to set over the valley, and the sky was a bruised palette of gold and deep purple as I sat on my wide wooden porch in the very same rocking chair where Arthur used to sit every evening for 40 years. The air was cooling down now, and it carried the sweet, heavy scent of crushed grapes and damp earth, because we had finished the final harvest of the season just yesterday, and the yields were the best we had seen in a decade. It has been 6 months since that dinner party, and the house feels different now, because the shadows no longer feel heavy with secrets, and the silence no longer feels like a threat. The vineyard is thriving, and I have hired a young couple who actually care about the soil and the vines to help me manage the daily operations, and they treat this land with a respect that Hugo could never understand. I received a letter from the district attorney last week, informing me that Hugo had been sentenced to 10 years for a laundry list of crimes, including forgery and attempted fraud and aggravated elder abuse. They found even more evidence once they started digging into his financial records, and it turns out he had been running similar scams on other vulnerable families for years. But he finally made the mistake of trying to play his games with a woman who knew how to read between the lines. Mr. Kress, the lawyer, has been disbarred and is facing his own set of charges for conspiracy. And it seems that the house of cards Hugo built has finally collapsed into a pile of dust. Sometimes I wonder if Hugo sits in his cell and thinks about the mistake he made, or if he still believes that he was the victim of a vindictive old woman who just refused to go away quietly. I picked up the bottle of 1945 Victory Vintage that was sitting on the side table, and I looked at the label, which was slightly torn, but still proud. I only have 3 bottles left now, and I have decided that I will not sell them for any price, because some things are meant to be cherished rather than liquidated for a profit. I poured a small amount of the dark red liquid into my glass, and I watched the way the light caught the deep garnet color. I raised the glass toward the rows of vines that stretched out toward the horizon, and I whispered a thank you to the man who planted them, and to the man who loved me enough to leave me with the strength to fight for them. Justice is a lot like wine, because it takes time to mature, and it requires the right conditions to reach its full potential. And sometimes it can be a bit bitter when you first taste it. But the finish is always smooth and lingering. Hugo thought that my age made me a target, but he forgot that with age comes an accumulation of knowledge and a sharpening of the instincts that can cut through a lie like a hot knife through wax. I took a sip of the wine, and I felt the warmth spread through my chest, and I leaned back in the chair and listened to the crickets beginning their nightly chorus in the tall grass. I am 72 years old, and my hands might shake a little when I am tired, and my eyes might need a bit of help from a magnifying glass. But my mind is a fortress, and my legacy is secure. The Galloway vines will continue to grow, and the wine will continue to flow. And as long as I am standing on this porch, the truth will always be the vintage of the house. I watched the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the hills, and I felt a profound sense of peace, because I knew that Arthur was resting easy, and I knew that I had done exactly what I was meant to do. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that family loyalty should always come first? Or is seeking justice against a dishonest relative a necessary act of self-preservation? Let me know in the comments below, and if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.